Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all of you to our second annual lecture in the Laws of Social Reproduction, titled From Reproducing Labor Power to Reproducing Our Struggle, a Strategy for a Revolutionary Feminism. I'm Prabha Kotiswaran. I'm Professor of Law at King's College London, and I'm the Principal Investigator for an EU-supported project called the Laws of Social Reproduction. My colleagues Shakti Nataraj, Shutapa Mazumdar, Sharda Rajam, Mihika Podar, and Annalisa Fagan join me in welcoming you all. So social reproduction is today as fashionable a term as it will ever be. For some decades, though, there has been a profusion of feminist scholarship on social reproduction. Feminists are theorizing social reproduction across various disciplines ranging from philosophy, economics, development studies through to sociology, geography, and increasingly law. Now, feminist understandings of reproductive labor are deep as they are wide-ranging. And much of this work uses Marxist and materialist feminist theorizing as its point of departure. And we have thought both with and beyond Marx to convincingly deconstruct the conceptual binaries that have prevented the recognition of women's reproductive labor, including the divides between production and reproduction, between the economic and the social, the market and the household, and the public and the private. Now, feminists study social reproduction in a vast range of institutional settings, including the home, but also childcare centers, schools, hospitals, care homes for the elderly, dance halls, and massage parlors. When studying social reproduction, we focus not only on capitalist economies, but also on diverse economies, including non-capitalist economies and para-capitalist economies of the developing world. Studies of social reproduction are also no longer limited to women. We reimagine social reproduction in non-heteronormative families and communities of care. In our own project at King's, we attempt a cross-sectoral study of women's labor across the market-marriage continuum. We study sex work alongside erotic dancing, surrogacy, paid work, and unpaid domestic work, focusing on India. And in particular, we are keen to interrogate the tremendous work that the law and legal categories do in governing women's work and in maintaining the boundaries between different groups of women workers that impedes their mobilization and produces poor economic outcomes. Now, for feminists theorizing social reproduction, the possibilities for political action have also expanded in recent years. Far from lobbying for discrete policy changes, feminists understand broader political struggles for housing, healthcare, food security, climate change, childcare, education, and indeed even pensions as being fundamentally about social reproduction. The pandemic has, of course, brought the riches of this feminist theorizing to the fore. The massive care infrastructure that holds up the visible GDP part of the economy has been revealed for all to see. Care is in the air and unpaid work is all the rage. We actually find hashtags like care income now or care can't wait trend on Twitter. And the green shoots of political opportunities which didn't exist are emerging even as powerful states like the US invest billions of dollars in care infrastructure. Yet the current moment is also filled with debt, and with mounting poverty. In India alone, 230 million people are said to have fallen below the poverty line. And so the path to recovery is daunting. And feminists have risen to this challenge of the moment. Several feminist manifestos seeking to reimagine a more just and equal world are in print, and many more are being written as we speak. Now, how do we embrace this moment to continue giving life to the anti-capitalist, anti-racist feminism that has had to jostle for too long in a crowded feminist space with various manifestations of lean-in feminism, of governance feminism, and of castral feminism? Further, how do we make our manifestos a reality? Now, I can hardly think of a more imaginative scholar who can speak to these questions than our distinguished speaker for today, Professor Silvia Federici, a scholar who has rigorously studied the gendered histories of capitalism, rendered visible the vast subsidies that unpaid care and domestic work offer to capital, and has reimagined resistance to capitalism in the form of the commons. Most importantly, her call to focus on the political journey for us to aspire to, what she calls actually joyful militancy, wherein political work is healing and makes us realize our own interdependencies, inspires hope for a truly revolutionary feminism. So Professor Federici, thank you so much. Although we are not able to welcome you to London in person, we are very grateful that you've agreed to deliver our second annual lecture. I'm also delighted today to welcome Professor Shamita Sen, who will chair and moderate our annual lecture. Now, Professor Shamita Sen, as you will all know, is a distinguished historian. She received her PhD from Cambridge University, and she was a junior research fellow at Trinity College. She taught at Calcutta University and Jadavpur University, and served as the first vice-chancellor of the Diamond Harbour Women's University. She was also dean of the Faculty of Interdisciplinary Studies at Jadavpur University. Her monograph, Women and Labour in Late Colonial India, the Bengal Jute Industry, published by Cambridge University Press in 1999, won the Trevor Rees Prize in Commonwealth History. She has published extensively on gender and labour. Her specialization is in colonial South Asia, but she has also conducted interdisciplinary research on contemporary issues such as domestic work and labour in the informal sector. Her 2016 book, Domestic Days, Women, Work and Politics in Contemporary Calcutta, co-authored with Nilanjana Sengupta, is a magnificent study of paid domestic workers in Calcutta, where her on-the-ground look at the conditions of social reproduction of paid domestic workers themselves is immensely generative for reimagining feminist theorizing on social reproduction. Professor Sen has also edited several books that provincialize received Marxist thinking, including Passage to Bondage, Labour in the Assam Tea Plantations, published in 2016, Accumulation in Post-Colonial Capitalism, also published in 2016, and Capital in the East, published in 2019, and more recently, Love, Labour and Law, Early and Child Marriage in India, published in 2021. Professor Sen has also been active in the women's movement in India and internationally. So thank you, Professor Sen, for joining us today. And before I hand over to Professor Sen, I wanted to invite you all attendees to please post your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom, which we can later collect for Professor Federici. We will not be looking at the chat function for questions, unfortunately, so please confine your questions to the Q&A space. And we will also be collecting questions from YouTube Live, where I understand we have a sizable number of attendees. And we will try our very best to answer as many questions as possible. And if you're tweeting about today's lecture, please use the hashtag Revolutionary Feminism. Thank you. I now hand over to Professor Sen to introduce Professor Federici.
Thank you, Professor Kotiswaran. It is indeed a very, very great pleasure to chair this annual lecture, the second annual lecture in the Laws of Social Reproduction, to be delivered by Professor Silvia Federici, someone with a long engagement with the subject and a very, very exciting title that we are all looking forward to hearing her on the topic From Reproducing Labor Power to Reproducing Our Struggle, a Strategy for a Revolutionary Feminism. Just to flag that the annual lecture is in fact linked to a project led by Professor Prabha Kotiswaran, which she has introduced. It is based at King's College London, and this lecture is also jointly hosted by IWWAGE. And in case you have missed the small print on the poster, IWWAGE is an acronym for a very interesting title: Initiative for What Works to Advance Women and Girls in the Economy, based in Delhi. So this is a remarkably appropriate time for the project, as Professor Kotiswaran has already said a little bit about. And for this lecture, when questions of social reproduction is taking center stage, and there is again, after a hiatus, a lot of interest in new political possibilities of and about social reproduction. And Professor Federici is about to make this connection very explicitly for us this afternoon. Professor Silvia Federici is Professor Emerita and teaching fellow at Hofstra University, where she was a social science professor. She is an Italian and American scholar, teacher, and activist. And she is from the radical feminist Marxist tradition. She's originally from Italy. When she was a graduate student in Buffalo in 1972, a friend gave her a tract in Italian by the feminist Maria Rosa della Costa. The most widely known version of this essay is called The Power of Women and the Subversion of Community, which many of you will have read. I read when I was a student, in which Della Costa wrote with the American activist Selma James. Federici soon became co-founder of the International Feminist Collective and an organizer with the Wages for Housework campaign. In 1973, she helped start Wages for Housework groups in the US. In 1975, she published Wages Against Housework, where she exposed how capital profits from our housework by sexualizing and naturalizing it. Federici considers the essence of the Wages for Housework campaign to be, and I quote from her writing, "It is the demand by which our nature ends and our struggle begins, because just to want wages for housework means to refuse that work as the expression of our nature, and therefore to refuse precisely the female role that capital has invented for us. It is necessary," she has pointed out many times, "to address the many misconceptions about the Wages for Housework campaign." In the 1990s, after a period of teaching in Nigeria, she was active in the anti-globalization movement and the US death penalty movement. In 2004, her highly acclaimed book was published, Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation. It is a magisterial social history, rethinking Marx's analysis of primitive accumulation from a feminist viewpoint. The main thesis of the book is that in order to understand the history of women in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, we must analyze the changes that capitalism has introduced in the process of social reproduction, and especially the reproduction of labor power. In the book, she examines the reorganization of housework, family life, child raising, sexuality, male-female relations, even as millions of agricultural workers were expropriated from their land, left pauperized and criminalized. She investigates relationships between production and reproduction in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the subjugation of women's bodies and the witch hunts in Europe and the New World. From this high point, many books have followed. Revolution at Point Zero, Housework, Reproduction, and Feminist Struggle, 2012. Witches, Witch Hunting, and Women, 2018. A documentation of the Wages for Housework campaign, the New York Wages for Housework Committee, History Theory Documents, 1972 to 1977, which she co-edited, which came out in 2017. Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, Rethinking, Remaking, Reclaiming the Body in Contemporary Capitalism, 2019. And very recently, 2021, Patriarchy of the Wage, Notes on Marx, Gender, and Feminism. In a slightly earlier book, Re-Enchanting the World, Feminism and the Politics of the Commons, which came out in 2018, which Professor Kotiswaran has already referred to. She sees globalization as a process of primitive accumulation, but also looks at commons as a point of resistance to that process. We see in this book the interlinkages of political organization and social reproduction. Professor Federici shows us in this book how to make sense of existing communitarian forms of social organization. To borrow a line from Peter Linebaugh, Professor Federici is a teacher, a social theorist, an activist, a historian, who will not separate politics from economics or ideas from life. She writes from those sites where history is made. The sidewalk with the street vendors, the group kitchen, the storefront collective, the park, women's shelters. She listens while she talks. Today, we look forward to listening while she talks. The most warmest welcome to Professor Federici. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sanita, and thank you, Prabha Kotiswaran, for this invitation. And it's a very great pleasure and honor for me to be here with you. And what I'll try to do in the brief time that I have is to, present a few concepts about what I believe has been revolutionary in the feminist program, and where I think the feminist program, the feminist struggle has to go and is already in fact going. The title of my lecture is Strategy for a Revolutionary Feminism. But I want to say, first of all, that feminism has already been a revolutionary movement. And of course, let me be very clear again, I do not refer to the state feminism that was manufactured in the 1970s and 80s and later by the United Nations and several governments whose only purpose was to glorify women's so-called integration into the global economy, which was a new round of exploitation of women's labor, adding to the exploitation of women's labor in the home. So I want to make very clear that when I speak of feminism, I speak of a very different reality from the kind of feminism that has been putting on its agenda the equality with men. Of course, we cannot be against equality with men, but certainly equal with which man? Because the assumption of equality with men is that the male world, the male working class is not exploited. So obviously those who put on their banner equality with men had in mind men of the upper classes. This is the only conclusion one can come to. But the other feminism has been revolutionary in that it has made visible a whole political terrain of struggle, a whole terrain of exploitation that had been completely ignored by the classical movement, of the left, socialist, Marxist, anarchist. And I believe to have uncovered, to have made visible, the whole process of reproduction, and in this process, redefining the redefinition of what is work, what is politics, what is a political struggle, what is capital exploitation, and what is capitalism itself, what is that nourishes capitalist accumulation, to have redefined, that whole universe of relation, I think has been a revolutionary process, a revolutionary contribution. And I must say, it is often belittled or forgotten by many of the new theorists of social reproduction. And this is why I'm particularly concerned with reasserting that. And I think the redefinition of what reproductive work and what is the specific form of exploitation that women suffer in capitalist society has been something that I think has not yet still been completely appreciated. Because this is what has emerged, is that we are engaged, women traditionally, at least the majority of women engage in activity who has a very double character, with an activity who both is essential for the reproduction of our life and therefore is intimately in all its form involved in the reproduction of life, and at the same time continuously capture, distort, that finalize, to the reproduction of our exploitation, to the reproduction of labor power, the workforce, and etc. And that duality, that continuous duality, that has torn women's life apart, that has also created a continuous daily emotional struggle. Because every time, for example, women have wanted to refuse this work, they have confronted the fact that part of this refusal has appeared as a refusal of relation that tied them, to their family, to the people they love, to their children. And for the feminist movement to be able to put words, to clarify what belongs to capital in a certain way, what in our work, what in this activity has been constructed, has been distorted to benefit, capitalist accumulation, to benefit the capitalist organization of work. And what within it instead is important, because it's what ties us to the real reproduction of life. I think that to have brought to the surface that contradiction which shapes so much of women's life, has been a very, very important contribution. And it's something that we are continuously dealing with in our life. I mean, more recently, the call that came from women in Argentina, for a reproductive, for a strike, for a women's strike, right, has brought that contradiction very much to the foreground, showing that, in fact, a women's refusal of work, a women's strike cannot be conceptualized in the way that traditional strike by the male wage working class, have been constructed, precisely because of that duality, precisely because of that contradiction, but precisely also because of that contradiction. There's a tremendous knowledge that I think women have gained, a tremendous knowledge women have gained as to what is important for our life and what is not. What is that we need really to separate us from? Because I think that one of the dangers, and here I want to come closer to the present, one of the dangers that I think many women, many feminists have encountered is that the pain, the suffering, the exploitation, the devaluation of this work, and the fact that so much of this work has been done in isolation, and in a way that has suffocated our life, has led many women to think, okay, enough, this work, we have to, women's liberation, women's emancipation lies outside, completely outside of this work. Right? The dream that if we go outside the home, if we gain a job outside the home, this will in fact open up to us a world of creativity, a world of sociality, and in that process, right, the devaluation of their work, in a sense confirming the kind of devaluation of their work. And I want to say that in fact, one of the tasks, and this is one element of a revolutionary strategy for the feminist movement, is to, in fact, precisely learn, to revalue, those aspects of reproductive work those expert reproductive work that in fact are fundamental, to the reproduction of our life, and not be deluded by the fact that capitalism has penetrated so profoundly, in a sense of shaping and reshaping our life in the most intimate way, to actually discard this work as a whole, and to think that creativity, transformation, liberation lies only outside of the sphere of reproduction. And so, in a way, one first element of revolutionary, feminist strategies is to reclaim, is to regain, the understanding of the importance of reproductive life, of reproductive work, and reproductive activity. If the concept of work is still too impregnated, of the question of exploitation. So this is the first thing. I would say that, today the question of reproduction has come back on the scene, in a very explosive way, because the situation, that COVID has produced, the fact that so many women who in the 1980s and 90s had gone to work outside the home and looked for, and in some time gained, a certain autonomy through wage work, right, have been brought back into the home. And this, in a way, seems to me has proven, has demonstrated, the wisdom, in a way, of the position that we took, in the Wages for Household movement of the 1970s, which was that we cannot change the condition of women. And by women, I mean women who are not in possession, in control of capital, who are not benefiting, from the exploitation of other people. And women in the broadest sense of the word, in full awareness of all the differences and all the inequality that exists among women themselves. But there are still elements of commonalities that we cannot imagine a process of liberation simply by leaving so-called the home and ignoring the sphere of reproduction. I think it's very important, and it's the events of the last 30 and 40 years have proven that we, in fact, were very correct in our understanding on many different grounds. We have seen, in fact, that for the majority of women, work outside the home has not only been a form of liberation, but in most cases has not even provided the kind of autonomy that was sought for. For example, in the United States today, to a great extent, women working outside the home, are dependent, on loans by payday company loans to actually make do to the end of the month. So the work outside the home has become accompanied by a massive process of indebtment. Women use the wage to take a loan from one of these companies at interest rate at times of 50%, which means that they work in the home, outside the home, and yet to pay the loans that will probably follow them unless we change the condition fundamentally of our life. We follow them, throughout their lifetime. We have seen also that the majority of the jobs that women acquire outside the home, underpaid, precarious, in most cases, extension of the housework in the home, are not jobs that provide the kind of creativity and sociality. Most often reinforce the kind of isolation that women have suffered, in fact, in the home. And the statistics, you know, about women's health, women's life expectancy, you know, are in fact astounding. You know, across the board, we have seen, for example, a massive increase of, you know, use of, you know, tranquilizer, you know, use of antidepressant pills, and a decline in life expectancy, you know, all of this. And this is before COVID. This is before COVID. And now the COVID pandemic has demonstrated that unless we deal with the issue of reproduction, unless we deal with the fact that society, this society is not taking responsibility for our reproduction, that in fact, the majority of the work, of reproductive work, is still expected of women, that affects the life of the majority of women in every part of the world. You know, whatever else we do, whatever else they do, no? And I believe that even you know, all the new discussion and analysis of reproductive work and social reproduction have not come near, and I say it with full knowledge, have not come here to describe what is involved in this work, and particularly what is involved in domestic work. I think it would take the Encyclopedia Britannica to really describe what is the work of reproduction in the life of a woman. Often we speak of childcare. Childcare does not even convey, you know, what is involved in the process of caring for an infant and caring for a child, particularly through the first year of life. And we also forget that for women, in addition to the work of child raising, is the work of assisting people in their old age, of assisting people through their chronic infirmities. This is work that contains so many activities, so many duties, so much emotional stress. I don't think that we have yet found the word to express what is involved in the life of a woman that, for example, day after day, year after year, has to take care of a person who is dependent on her for her life because he or she, you know, has serious health problem. And that work is what is the lifeline, you know, for a parent, for a lover, for a friend. I want to say this because I think that they're actually the reality. You know, we say that domestic work, reproductive work is multitasking. Indeed, it's very multitasking because it's physical, it's intellectual, it's emotional, it's psychological. And all the work the women do in order to keep the communication in the home, to keep the communication beyond the simple exchange of words, but to actually maintain a process in which people communicate with each other, which is different from speaking to each other. Leopolda Fortunati has written very interesting text, you know, examining this difference, you know, how the fact that we are now more and more speaking with each other in a very instrumental way, but we are not communicating. We are not actually speaking to our deepest feeling, to the transformation that we go through, our fears, our desires, and how the new communicative technology, whether it is the computer, the internet, the phone, the television, actually occlude, hide that crisis, a crisis that is rooted in the lack of time, you know, in the lack of energies, because communication is also work, takes energy to contact really another person. But less and less, life is so pressing, is so precarious, is so full of worries that we do not engage any longer in that communication. Although it is women, the ones who mostly attempt and strive to keep the communication in the family and also reconcile all the different crises that can arise. So I think, and this is a second point that I want to make, and it's important that we take with us as we think about how we change the world, that in the process of being exploited in a very specific way in the capitalist organization of wars, we also have acquired a lot of knowledges. Because of the double character of reproductive work, there is also knowledge that we have acquired. There's also knowledge that a lot of women have acquired as what is important about life, as what is useful, what is important, what is that gives us life, and what is that kills us. And I think this is a knowledge that women have are bringing to all the revolutionary movement in which they are involved, the feminist movement, but also the ecological movement. It is not an accident, for instance, that today across the world, from England, I read articles that women are leading the struggle against fracking in England, to the Amazon. It is women who are really in the front line in the struggle for the defense of the natural environment, the struggle against deforestation, the struggle against monoculture, the struggle for recuperating all the system of agriculture, and the struggle against the destruction, the mining, petroleum drilling is doing in community, poisoning the water, often having to fight, against the men of their community, and certainly the men hired by these companies, and discovering that the destruction of the natural world goes hand in hand with an exacerbation, of patriarchal violence. That when a mine, for example, enters an area, the violence against women, increases, because the work of the mining is work that is brutalizing for the men. And in many ways, they attempt, as so often men do, to recuperate some sense of life at the expense of women. So I want to say that today, the feminist movement has a great contribution to make to the change and the construction of a non-capitalist society, and the struggle against all forms of oppression, all forms of inequality, and starting from the perspective of reproduction. And here I want to say something very important, a third point, a point that was brought out very powerfully recently by Veronica Gargo, one of the leading voices in the Ni Una Menos movement in Argentina, in her book Potencia Feminista. We should not look at reproduction as a kind of another economic sector to place side by side with production. We should not place it, like the complementary part of the organizational work. But we should actually look at reproduction as something, as a broader perspective from which to look at the world, from which to look at struggle, from which to look at the revolution, that does not make separation, that does not separate people's life into different compartments, but actually looks at their life, wherever they are, whatever they do, from a very holistic viewpoint. And so the reproduction, in a sense, becomes the biggest category. Becomes the biggest category because it says it's the category that allows us to think of the organization of work, the production of social wealth and social change from the point of view of what is that makes us prosper, what is that gives us life, what is that makes life thrives, and what is that destroys it. So this is the perspective, and in that sense, when we speak of reproduction, is a perspective that we can bring everywhere, not only in terms of the home or the community or all the different branches of the service sector or agriculture, major place of reproduction, but it's a perspective that we should bring also in the so-called world of production. That we want to see a world, for instance, and this is part of what we need to fight for, in which when we take a job outside the home or a wage job in any part of the organizational work, we struggle not only about time, we struggle not only about wages or conditions of work, but we struggle also about what is being produced. What is being produced? Is what is being produced something that is beneficiary to people? Or we are producing, nerving gas, we are producing bombs, we are producing arms, etc. No? So reproduction is a very broad perspective. It's not just a set of, it's like the commons, it's not just a set of particular activity. It's a principle, it's a conception, of how we look at life, how we look at social relation, how we look at the production of social wealth. Now, strategies. In the 1970s, we created a movement, a number of us, of wages for household, that was very misunderstood, as you, Prabha, and as Sanita have pointed out, was very misunderstood because it was understood in a very union, framework, as if it was part of a union productivity deal. Give us some money and we'll continue doing this work. While for us, it had very, very different, finalities. One, first of all, was to make it visible. We thought that demanding a wage would be the most effective way to make visible the capitalist nature of this work, to redefine this work, and show how it is directly, intimately involved in the reproduction of the workforce at all its levels. And of course, also the whole question of sex work. So many feminists have taken a very puritanical position about sex work, and not seen, for instance, that because women have been traditionally in capitalism excluded from monetary relation, who have had a very precarious relation to monetary relation, selling our body, whether in the street or in marriage, has always been, the possibility of survival has always been an option. And that the kind of work the women have accessed outside the home has been so destructive, and that often sex work has appeared as a better option. And so we saw wages for household as bringing out to the surface a whole history of women's struggle, and making visible this work. And also, and here I want to make the connection with the present, triggering a process of reappropriation, and undermining the idea that, for example, the welfare position that were in place in the United States, women with younger children receiving some money from the states, that this was charity, undermining the idea that we were fighting for work, that we were not working already. And also, presenting the bill to the state, presenting to the state our bill, saying, we have been working for you. Your wealth has been built on the back of our mother and grandmother. Clearly more if it is Black women, or the bill goes back to slavery, if women in the colonial world. But capitalism has been built on the unpaid, also on the unpaid labor of women. And we are not fighting, for more work, right? Let's fight, first of all, to reclaim the wealth that we have produced. In other words, we refuse to say our liberation and so on is fighting for wage labor, that we need to get wage labor in order to be part of the working class or in order to receive some independence. It seemed to us that we had to deal with that age-old question, the age-old question of the naturalization of domestic work, the naturalization before we could contract, before we could change our life and our relationship with men, with other people, with capitalism in any other place. This, of course, was not, a call for not taking work outside the home. We all were working outside the home. There was not even a choice, in the 70s already. Having a wage job was the minimum, not to be completely dependent on a man. But I think it's very important to see, and I think that today, and this is another point that I want to stress, and I hope we can talk in the discussion, the global movement of domestic workers has brought back, in times when a lot of feminists have forgotten about reproduction, before COVID, or before the last years when everybody now speaks of social reproduction. But for a long time in the 80s and 90s, reproduction kind of vanished, except for abortion, right? The global domestic workers movement, which is a movement which is very powerful and important, because it's a movement that brings together the question of sexism, the capitalist exploitation of female labor, with the question of coloniality. Most women come, from former colonial world. We could say from the colonial world, because colonization is not ended. Globalization is a form of colonization. Colonization has only changed form. It's like slavery in the United States. We still have slavery, except now it's called mass incarceration. It's organized to mass incarceration. In the same way, coloniality is still a fundamental structural characteristic of capitalist society, except that today coloniality is organized through the World Bank, the IMF, the Structural Adjustment Program, all the companies, extractivism. This is a colonial world. This is still a colonial world. And domestic workers have brought that, and the struggle against racism. So their struggle is very rich because it touches on all the, in a sense, the crimes that this society, and of course, it's a movement, the fight for the elimination of all restriction on immigration, an immigration that is being forced by international capitalist politics. So I think that this movement is a movement that has to be at the center of feminist mobilizing. That wherever feminist activism is involved, has to fundamentally support, connect with the struggle of domestic worker. Back to the point about the wages for household movement, as a movement that was primarily a movement of reappropriation of the wealth the women have produced. And I think the question of reappropriation, when we speak of a revolutionary feminist strategies, is fundamental. We cannot change the world unless we cannot change the world. I'm sorry, I have a phone in the background. Okay. We cannot change the world on the basis of a reconstruction, redistribution, reorganization of our poverty. Any feminist movement who is engaged in a truly revolutionary transformative strategies has to engage in a process of reappropriation. Reappropriation of resources, of social wealth, reappropriation of time and space. This means that we have to be present and connect with a whole variety of struggle. The struggle for the reduction of work time. The struggle for the reduction of work time is very, very important. I'm going to come back to it. The struggle for the control of space, housing, urban space, the right to be in the street. For example, one of the responses, of women across the world to the crisis of the male wage and to the crisis of traditional forms of work has been to go out en masse in the street, in India, throughout Latin America. In Africa already, the markets were dominated by women, were a big women's common. The markets was a great female common. But now this has expanded, women going into the street, bringing, in fact, their reproduction into the street, to sell something, some services, snacks, etc. So, and there faces a tremendous amount of violence by the police, violence, by shopkeepers who see them as a competition. And, but at the same time, this is a whole struggle about space, not the only one, of course, the space about housing, and which is a struggle not only about rents, it is also a struggle for creating housing, forms of housing that do not separate us, that includes communal spaces, the commune areas and spaces in which we can come together, right? So that process of reappropriation of time, space, social resources is fundamental, equally important. And this is what I've been writing about and continuously learning from the experience of women, the politics of the common. Equally important, the construction of reproductive commons, right? The construction of communitarian, communal, collaborative, cooperative forms of reproduction. And here I'm not speaking of a utopia. Here I'm speaking of a reality that is already taking place. The great female common of the market, the women occupying the street and struggling, struggling to maintain this space. Yeah, it's now everywhere, and has been the response. It's very important. It's been the response from Africa to Latin America to the United States to the crisis of reproduction that we have faced, to the crisis of reproduction, to the fact that more and more as capitalist relations are expanding and people are being expelled, from their ancestral areas. They're being expelled from their land. They've been expelled from their forests. They've been expelled from their, population. Women in particular have been able to reconstitute, in urban spaces, and wherever they have been they have been able to reconstitute new forms of life by joining their forces, by coming together, by collectively, constructing places to live in, building roads, creating urban gardens, creating spaces where to join and have assemblies and come together to make decisions collectively, to decide what is that we need. The whole assembly movement, for example, that has developed in Latin America, from the piqueteros, the movement of piqueteras on. Women have brought their reproduction into the street, but also they have reorganized it in a communal way, and in a way that has given them a tremendous strength to confront the state, to put demand to the state, And first of all, not to be separated, not to be destroyed by the crisis that they were meeting. I think that this movement that now is very broad and that extends from Standing Rock, the incredible assemblage of women and people that was, fighting, organized by women who call themselves the Defensora of the Water, that defends women who defend the waters against the pipeline who poison their traditional form of access to water, to Bolivia, to the periphery of Buenos Aires, Mexico, all the places where women have reconstituted, right, this communitarian relation. And I think that this is a lesson that we have to learn from. Obviously, there are no models, right? We cannot think of this is a model, we're going to export it. Each situation has its own peculiarity. I imagine that the construction of commons, rural, urban commons in India or in Peru, etc., takes different form because we have different historical, political trajectories. But there are commonalities. There are commonalities. The fact that we need to bring together to unite what capitalism has separated. We need to construct a society in which what capitalism has separated is brought together at all levels. The countryside with the city, production and reproduction, and organized in a way that has as a primary goal undermining the inequalities that capitalism has planted in our bodies, in the working class, has planted all through its history. And this is something for me very, very, very central. And from Caliban and the Wage through all my work, right? We cannot speak of building a society constructed on the principle of commonality and collaboration, unless we place as a central goal, the undermining of racism, colonialism, imperialism. And this, in a way, is, the fundamental, task, of every social movement who wants to create a different society, and for the feminist movement as well. But in order to gain the strength, to confront the mega capitalist machine, and for example, organize, which I hope we'll do, which has been happening, but in very sporadic ways, in order to organize the kind of movement that has the power, for instance, to put an end to the war machine, to the production of arms, to the destruction of countries. We have seen one after another, Somalia, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, countries being torn apart. We need a feminist movement. We need feminist mobilization that is able to put an end to this kind of destruction. We need a feminist mobilization that is intervening to put an end to the fact that now companies, mining companies, oiling companies, fracking, logging, can go to any country in the world and destroy the livelihood, destroy the habitat. We need a feminist movement who puts into practice on a mass level what we have learned, from the whole history of reproduction about what gives rise and what is killing us. But in order to do that, in order to gain the strength, we also have to work at the local level, and to work at the local level to actually create, on a day-to-day basis, different forms of relation, different forms of reproduction. One of the great revolutionary principles the feminist movement launched, starting from the beginning, from the 70s, has been that you cannot change the world unless you change your daily life. It's something that we learn, out of necessity, because we discover that in many cases, if we wanted to go to a demonstration against the war or the student movement, etc., we had to fight with the people in our family, with our father, with our brother, with our lovers. In other words, that we couldn't really, women have been so dependent, made dependent on men on all levels of our life, that the moment we wanted to actually fight against the system, we discovered we first had to fight for the embodiment of patriarchalism in our home. For those in our home who in a way represented the state, because of the power of their wages. I've written many times that capitalism has delegated to men, the power to supervise, control women's life, has never had to control us directly. They have to, particularly around issues of procreation, reproductive life, etc. But most of the control has been indirectly through men. So this idea that you cannot fight, you cannot make a revolution unless you start transforming your everyday life, it's very powerful. And this is why every women's movement is a movement that has to first confront the question of patriarchalism. So change our daily life. That means many things today. And there is now a rich literature. If we talk about social reproduction, we have to look not at the academic theories, but we also have to look at the experience that is coming from so many women, particularly from the global south, Or for example, if they are fighting, against the destruction of a forest, often they have to fight with the men in their community who do not see, who may be interested in the money that a company brings and not have the long-term vision that says once the forest is gone, our own life as a community is gone. So the transformation of the daily life, the creation of more connective, collaborative forms of reproduction, breaking down the individualism and the isolation that comes with it, which makes us more vulnerable, which makes it easy to defeat us, to break down, to construct a movement that is political and nevertheless creates affective ties, creates a trust, creates challenges, this old perverse ideology coming from a capitalist state that basically says, oh, be careful with other people are a threat. Every night, the television, everything is a bombardment, about the fact that you turn the corner and somebody's out there to kill you. Regaining that not only trust in other people, but the excitement, the relearning what a wealth it is to be in a communal relation with other people. That other people are not a threat, but they are an enrichment. And how much they enrich our life, how much power it comes to be engaged in forms of reproduction in which you're not alone, in which you do not confront your pain, your suffering, your crisis alone. And there's somebody there with whom we can share. And how our imagination, our consciousness expands. And we can see different possibilities. The fact that we can actually imagine if we are alone at home, but if we are in 20,000 or 10,000 or even 100 in a street or 10 in a park, we can actually see, other possibility. This to me is the revolutionary strategy. There has to work at different levels. There has to work at a level which is the level of the reconstruction, the communal reconstruction of our everyday life, so that to gain the strength for the process of reappropriation and for the process of mobilization that in fact confronts the state in its all, lethal power, whether it is the police, whether it is the war machine, and whether it is an unjust, systematically unjust, institutionally racist organization of the distribution of wealth. I think this is the process and this is the agenda for revolutionary feminism. And the idea fundamentally is the revolution is not in the future, it's now. The revolution is now. It's not something that we have to look at, to be achieved. And it doesn't have to be identified with an immediate change of the whole system, but it begins with the process of transformation in our life, in our communities. And this is where we start. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Federici. That was absolutely riveting. And I will take back revolution is now as a slogan from this talk. But there was another slogan for me in this talk, and that is that the end of politics today must be to bring back together what capitalism has separated. Yes. I think that is a very, very fundamental insight that you've offered us in today's talk. And of course, the pandemic has symbolized that in the term homework, used in a very different way from how we have previously used the term homeworking, showing us to many people almost sort of, unlike historians, many people are not aware of how fundamentally capitalist industrialization separated home and work. And that indeed bringing home and work together is not a new thing, but is a return to a previous dispensation. But of course, home and work and space is not the only thing that capitalism has separated, as you have very rightly pointed out, that it is a set of overlapping relations of separation which have to be returned to much more creative relationships and in different ways. I take three major points from your talk. One is that we have to, the issue you highlight about duality of work. And I think the pandemic in another sense is a context for that, because it is today in the midst of the threat to life. I think that we appreciate the value of reproduction as life-making. And I think that strong assertion of life-making came through at different levels in your talk. I see also the link you make between life-making work with knowledge systems. I also see the direct link you make with that knowledge, that those systems of knowledge and frontline environmental activism, which is another form of assertion of life-making in today's context. I connect that to how you talk about politics in that context, in that specific context of reproduction as life-making. And you say two things, I think. You say that we have to reconstitute forms of life with our politics. And you say that we have to reconstitute relationships with that politics. And your focus on relationship with people, I think, is another very important form of life making that is not as given as much importance as we should. And of course, you talk about this is not utopian. And I think that's the very important emphasis in your talk. So this kind of, if we have to say revolution is now, we also have to take on board that we are confronting nodes of power. Yeah. And we are confronting both state and patriarchy. And state, of course, with all its violence, but also patriarchy, which means everyday life, which means that revolution has to be fought all the time in your daily life, in your everyday relationships. This is obviously a big ask and a difficult objective of politics. So we take all that from your talk. We have a number of questions already stacked up. Should I, Prabha, read out some of the questions, or yes, how do you want to? Yeah,
sure. I think we can bunch together a few of the questions. I think one of the first questions is about the issue of, solidarity between women and how cross-cutting identities have, hampered the feminist movement. For example, like race, through religion, different caste statuses, and actually also Ria's question about class status, which is, she says it more concretely to say, how does one reconcile the rights of her domestic worker with those of her mother? Because clearly they are antithetical to each other. So, less work for the domestic worker is actually more work for the mother. So it's actually in some very fundamental, immediate ways, the interests of women can be, conflicting in some very real ways on a day-to-day basis. So that is sort of two questions together. Maybe you can respond to that, and then we'll collect a few more questions for you.
Yeah, I think when I expect to bring together what, the capitalism has divided, I didn't mean, I think it's very important not to think of the politics of unite and fight, or the people, all of that, because the traditional left movement have always been to assume a unity, of the working class that in fact had to be constructed. And this applies to women as well, because there are, in fact, differences. And I wouldn't put class differences, because of course there are class differences. But to me, class separates, those who have control of capital and those who do not have control of capital. And if you have control of capital, it's very difficult to really establish any alliance. But differences from the point of view of coloniality, from the point of view of racism, from the point of view, when I spoke at the domestic workers movement, I think that all those contradictions within the feminist movement come to the foreground. And in fact, one of the issues I've had with many feminists, who have said, oh, let's not talk about reproductive work. Let's not talk about domestic work. Oh, God forbid, for wages for housework. Let's think only about working outside the home. And then what? They might hire a domestic worker. So they were afraid about us institutionalizing women in the home, but they've not been afraid of hundreds of thousands of women, impoverished by the IMF, the World Bank, et cetera, expelled from their land, et cetera, then being institutionalized in our home and being in a relation of, maid and master, mostly confronting another woman. This is a contradiction in the women's movement that has to be really confronted much more than it has been. I think that now we have a very strong, domestic workers movement internationally, and I think that every feminist organization should support it, right? But the fundamental issue is to change the condition of reproductive work, to change the condition across the world, so that, for example, women are not forced to leave their home and their children, which then are taken care by other women. Hochschild has spoken about the care chain, the existence of a global care chain, and forced to live in condition of really separation from their family for many, many years of their life, and above all, having to battle in order to have their work valued, recognized, and not to be continuously threatened with deportation. All of that struggle, is a struggle that fundamentally begins with us coming together in a movement that changes the condition of reproductive work, that changes the condition in which the devalorization, the devaluing of reproductive work that we see in the condition of domestic workers, who do it for a wage, is exemplary, is a direct consequence of the devaluation that this work has in the plan of capitalism. And so for me, the basis on which we can build solidarity, between domestic worker and, proletarian women, working class women, is to join in a struggle so that domestic work, reproductive work as a whole, is changed, is valorized. And this is a first step. This is a first step. And obviously we want to construct a world in which women don't have to leave their family and go care for the children of other families. But the first step is to also create a world in which we deal with the question of this work. As of now, there is no doubt that there is an inequality that is built. There is no doubt, the question of the domestic worker and her mother. So we have to expand, for instance, the wealth, the resources that are available, to women, all women, in terms of reproduction, right? Because that misery that often puts one woman against another, because the working class woman may not have the money to, for example, pay somebody who takes care of a child, or afford, a daycare center, right? So that all that workers in a daycare center are completely underpaid. Yeah. And so all of that has to do with the question of the responsibility that the state, the society, the government has towards reproductive work. The fact that they've made a lot of money out of women's work, and the money is not coming back to us. Those resources are not coming back to us. So I think that the question of the material condition of this work is fundamental also in the question of the construction of solidarity about different women.
We have a set of related questions from Deepta Chopra and Tanvi Chitranshi, which takes this, what you just said, a little further.
Yes.
And they are Deepta Chopra is asking you about the way women confront patriarchy in their everyday lives using the language of patriarchy. So they engage in struggles against patriarchy using the language of patriarchy. And how can we conceptualize this agency of women?
Can we get an example there?
I will have to ask Dipta that. But Tanvi is asking a related question about how does one shift from individualism to a sense of community without compromising women's freedom, given that many communities are inherently patriarchal and they tend to sideline existence of women as an independent entity. Deepta says, let me read what she says actually, that might help you formulate we have seen in recent movements that women redefine the boundaries of their homes using the language of patriarchy, yet reinventing the space that they have to engage in struggles. How do you conceptualize this agency?
Okay, so I'm not sure that I completely understand the first question, but I would say perhaps that, there has been, a process, the neoliberalization of everyday life has had tremendous consequences on all aspects, cultural, political. It's very few areas that have not been touched. And I see now, for example, this new generation of younger women who express themselves with, even if they're not, in terms of their class status and in terms of their work, even if they're not committed to a neoliberal society, but nevertheless are culturally, affected by it, right? And so it seems to me that, this is something that we need to control, to struggle against, because it's a very insidious way, right? This very efficiency-oriented way, for example, to look at the home, right? I hear and read about description of the home that is not any longer, a place of effective relation, reproduction, etc., but now more and more, it's also a factory. I mean, it's always been a factory of human being, but now it's a factory in many more ways, because so much of the work that was done outside of the home is now brought into. And so the question of criteria of efficiency in the organization of everyday life have come and dominated even more than in the past, the organization of family relation. So perhaps this is what I'd like to know if what I see corresponds to what she had in her mind, right? And, I think that if that is what she has in her mind, this is a serious issue, because capitalist efficiency is not our conception of what is useful, for life, our life to thrive, and the reorganization of the, actually, the home until now has not been, affected, only I think perhaps what we begin to see now with capitalism attempting to send so many women back to the home, we may begin to see, changes in the organization of reproductive work that until now we have not seen. For instance, very little new technology has come into the home in the last 40 years. After the dishwasher, after the washing machine, and maybe the micro oven, the only other technologies that have come in has been, I don't know, telephone, television, the computer. There hasn't been, because so much of the work is still done, by women as unpaid labor. And in fact, it's very difficult to imagine how to technologize completely our reproductive life. I know there have been attempts to create nurse bots, lab bots, robot, but I don't know, the idea of a home, no matter how big, but full of robots. And can we robotize the care of children? Can we robotize the care of older people? And in fact, this is one of the issues I have with Marx. It's great, trust in the liberating power of large-scale industry and capitalist technology once that technology has been transferred in other hands, in our hands, in workers' hands, right? But really, there's a whole area of life, the area of reproduction, that cannot be technologized. Now the television is seen as an alternative mother. You put the child there and is a babysitter, right? The television is the babysitter. But we also know that certainly this is far from an ideal. And the interaction with the human being is very important for the development, emotional, intellectual of a child. So we have to take into account, this whole idea of the technological transformation and applying the efficiency that, is used by capitalism in outside work and bringing it to the home. And I think to the extent that we have now, maybe women who are thinking in those terms, right? That is a problem, because I don't think this is the solution. Certainly I'm not, and I don't think we should be against technology, but what kind of technology? What kind of technology, and where it is properly applied and where it is not applied, where it amplifies human relation and where it suffocates human relation. I think is a very important subject of feminist thinking, the whole question of technology. That has to be, yeah. And the other question was, remind me.
Community. So what about
the community and the
patriarchy of
freedom?
the community?
Yeah, but this is in every relation. I mean, it's on in every relation that we have. Actually, I would say that is in the community that we can actually gain a sense of freedom. That the idea that somehow community is suffocating of individual creativity, is by thinking of very patriarchal communities, that have always been dominated and structured, not on a communitarian. The communitarian is very horizontal, right? When we're speaking of communitarian, we speak of horizontal, not vertical relation, not a community that is built on some dominating the structure of relation. We're speaking of community built on egalitarian principle, right? Built on interconnectedness, interdependence, recognition of interdependence, not on community where you have the patriarch on the top, as in the old patriarchal village, and where community, the safety of community is exchanged for, the price of being dominated. Now, so that's, of course, is a struggle. That, of course, is a struggle. But it's a very different conception of community.
So there's a couple of questions on wages for housework, which I know that many people are very keen to hear from you on. Yes. So there's the question of commodification that is implicit in the idea of wages for housework.
Yes.
I think one of the participants wants to know whether that doesn't go against the very critique of capitalism. So, how would the critique of capitalism be possible if you had this idea of commodification built in there? A related question is from Neha Vadwan, who is with the ILO in Delhi. And she talks about how, certainly in the Indian context, this has assumed a lot of, this has been debated recently quite intensively. So she says, if we ask for, so certain political parties have been willing to give, a sort of unconditional cash transfer for unpaid work. And so what she's saying is one of the arguments opposing such transfers is the fact that it is a very small amount. Especially in the context of a developing country, it tends to be a meager handout. So she's saying, what do we do here? Should we instead struggle for a higher valuation of housework by the state, or should we focus on better reorganization and sharing the housework within the household? Or should we have capitalism pay more for work outside the home? This is, and I think there's a variation of this question by Pascal McDougall, who says, she says you've not emphasized very much the constraints that capitalism might put on the feasibility of a policy like wages for housework on a large scale, which is presumably paid through fiscal means. And she says she has in mind claims like those of Wolfgang Streeck, who, building on Kalecki, argued that fiscal spending to stimulate employment is ultimately impossible because it requires taxes on capital which threaten the system. So, how does one, what would your position be on this kind of systemic constraint that there might be on the state's ability to rearrange the household market boundary through fiscal means? So a set of questions.
All right. So that's a big, very great question. These are really great questions, and to the first one about the commodification, two things, very simple two things. Number one, we never stated the wages for housework was liberation or the revolution, that wages for housework, the state paying, for this work, represented the idea of society. We always saw wages for housework as a temporary strategy to change women's relation with capital women's relation with employers and women's relation to men, right? To deal with the situation that women are either or dependent on men or having to do two jobs in order to have a minimal autonomy. And many times, even two jobs was not enough for that autonomy. So the idea that wages for housework was a revolution, no, wages for housework was a strategy that seemed preferable and more effective than the alternative, which was give us work, give us, struggling for, was not in contradiction with that. Women still would be able to work outside the home if they wanted, but they wouldn't go outside the home empty-handed. And we saw over and over and over that when women started looking for a job, the fact that they had this other story in the back, a child at home, etc., fundamentally defined the relationship that they could obtain when they looked waged employment. The women did not enter into a wage employment relation in the same way as men, because women went into wage employment with all this back of housework, going back to the home, the children, and this, and this, and this, and this. Number one. So wages for housework responded to a strategy saying we have to deal with the question of housework before we can actually, or at least together with, dealing with wage employment. Number one. Number two, and here is my question, the fundamental thing, I've been over and over and over, in wonder that the issue of commodification only comes when women are demanding money for the work they do in the home. It never comes when people take a job outside of the home. Why the people are worried about the commodification that comes demanding to be paid for the work you do? Why they don't give up their wages? If you want, the implicit idea is that we fight capitalism by working for free. We fight capitalism by giving up. So why teachers get to paid? Aren't they commodifying education? Why nurses should get paid? Aren't they commodifying healthcare? Why anybody, factory worker, office worker, should get paid? Let's have a movement to eliminate wages and all work for free. Is that the solution to fighting capitalism? We are saying that capitalism has made millions off our backs. There used to be a journal in England called Off Our Backs. Very powerful feminist journal. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about reparation and, being able to make different choices. Not having to rush out of the home with a child, a baby just born, because we need a little money to survive. We talk about not being forced to be with a man who abuses us because we don't have the money. Often in our meeting, when we go out in working class proletarian neighborhood, and we say, there are women accusing us of institutionalizing women in the home, demanding, and women will say, we are already institutionalized. I have no money for the bus. I have no money and no time to be able to do something other than staying home, even if I have a little time. And I have to ask everything, even for a pair of socks, to my husband. And that's humiliating. I mean, people don't understand, asking that question. And generally, often it's people who ask the commodification question and definitely not ready to give up their own wages or worry about being involved in a commodification process. So that's one question. The other one about the question of sharing, well, you know, sharing, of course, women have asked for sharing all along, and but that's not enough, because what we're talking is a particular relation and form of exploitation of capitalism of this work. And so we may share the exploitation, we may share the unpaid labor, and it's great, would be great the men began to share in the housework. But it does not change the fact that we have a capitalist society that thrived and builds billions on the basis of this unpaid labor, you know. So the question of, you know, and bringing housework out of the home. Well, we now have 30 years, you know, of commercialization of housework. In the United States, fast food is considered one of the main causes of obesity. Fast food, fast life, fast death. Obesity has reached levels that are incredible. So many people are now completely, you know, undermined in whatever they can do. And clearly the poor nutrition, you know, they have access to. What? Any form outside work, industrializing certain aspects of work, that might be important. But not all forms of housework can be industrialized. And now we see bringing work outside the home, great. But how do we pay for it? The cost of it. So we have women who have these jobs which are already very poorly paid. And then you pay for the daycare, and then you pay for the this, and then you pay for that. So there has to be a redistribution of wealth. So when the work is brought, the housework is brought outside the home, it has, for example, to be well paid. It is not now. And it is not because the work is devalued. So it's a whole chain. You know, it is a whole chain. The issue of reproductive work and the society taking responsibility, the reappropriation of resources, that has to happen. How it happens, in what forms, this is something the community of women have to decide on the ground. There is no really general model, but that reappropriation and reorganization has to take place. Because otherwise, transferring from here to there without changing in the value that is placed on it and the resources that are supporting it will not really transform neither the work nor the life of women. And the last one, the question of fiscal. You know, over and over and over we were told, I remember, you know, in the 70s, we were told so many times, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to pay? And the money, who's going to pay? And the working class is going to pay for it. You know, in the United States, I think the United States has paid more than $1 trillion in wars, in the cost of destroying one country after another. In Afghanistan, the money that the United States government has devoted to this, basically, you know, fighting 20 years of war, which have practically torn the country apart. We see now what is happening, the condition in which the country has been. And the money, just in Afghanistan, I think the United States has, I don't know, hundreds of military bases across the world. Think of that money. Think of the trillions. Fiscal responsibility. Fiscal responsibility. You know, they have huge amount of money. The only concern about the lack of money is when it comes to housework, when it comes to childcare, when it comes to reproductive work, when it comes to our life. This is the devaluation of our life. They can find a lot of money to destroy countries. They build in factories producing bombs, trillions devoted to killing people, but not when it comes to some money for a woman who is a prisoner of the home because she has a child, because she has somebody who has a chronic disease. Then there is no money. Then we have to talk about fiscal responsibility. They only talk about fiscal responsibility about women, and I want to say this, has been said many times. In the world, not only in the United States, producing bombs is productive work. Is work that is considered to add to the wealth of the nation. Raising a child is not. Raising a child is not. So I think that principle, and unless we change profoundly that principle that governs the society, fiscal responsibility should come, dealing with the question of capitalism, destructive power. And we should use it when we talk about the investment in warfare, not when we talk about investment in life. Yeah.
Thank you, Silvia. I'll ask you another slightly complicated question that has been asked. Gender and Sex, written by Judith Butler, and Marxists. For Marxists, this understanding of gender and sex as superstructures is important. The imposition of gendered relationships and the organization of cis heteronormative nuclear family also calls for the abolition of gender and sex. So do you think queer communism, beyond just depending on binaries of men and women, are important to the revolution? Well, and it says in brackets that mainstream feminism has been trans exclusionary.
I don't know about dominant feminism. I'm in touch with feminist organization groups collectively across the world, and that's not my experience. And so I know that there's been feminist movements or feminist organizations or individuals who have made comments about trans people. But I do not believe that the feminist movement as a whole has been against So let's say a number of things. Number one, it has been the feminist movement who has attached the so-called the binary. Actually, the feminist movement has said that what we call the prescription, the gender norms that structure women and men's life have been social construction. That there's nothing in the biology, in the material organization of people's body, women, men, and intersex. Because now we know that there is a whole world of intersex people, that the binary is not a material reality of the human species, right? So I think the women's movement has been the first one who has spoken of gender as a social construction. This today is often forgotten. It seems we have discovered the critique of gender roles as if it was an innovation, whereas it has been one of the first lines of attack of the feminist movement, to say actually women and men are social construction. These are not biological given, at least the way we are expected to perform. At the same time, and this I want to equally stress it, is that gender is a terrain of struggle. The definition of what it means to be woman, what it means to be man, as being part of the struggle of the movement. The feminist movement has been a whole struggle to give a very different content to this term, to this category. And in fact, to oppose all the canonic norms that have been imposed on us. And so it seems to me that the feminist movement is what has given power, in fact, to the gay movement to come out, the same way it's given power also to the sex workers movement, even though there are many feminists who are against sex work. But nevertheless, I'll say that the feminist movement denouncing the prostitution in the family, for instance, denouncing the women have had to sell their body, to sell their life in the family for economic support, has given power to the sex worker movement, has given power to the lesbian movement, to the gay movement, and has given power to the queer movement. I think that the matrix from which a lot of these changes have come has been precisely the work the feminists have made. Yeah, which of course, feminism has many voices. Now we speak of feminisms, I think is a good idea, because we have seen state feminism, we have seen neoliberal feminism, and etc. Now, I have been stressing over and over that the change of gender identity has to come accompanied by a change of material condition of life. We can change from being woman to man, or we can say, oh, I'm neither woman nor man, but if actually the organization of work is still maintain those forms of exploitation, then we have not gained. We may have gained on a certain level, but we are not really constructed a different society. So it has to be accompanied with a transformation in the material condition of our life. And I think this is important. Some of my criticism of the way Judy Butler has been understood, as being this idea that somehow we perform being a woman, or we perform being a man, we perform certain kind of activities. Well, it's like saying that, working class exploitation is a matter of performance. It's been a minor a performance, it's been exploited as a factory worker, a performance. If we're speaking of women's unpaid labor, confinement to reproduction, confinement to certain type of jobs, we're speaking of very material economic condition. We're not speaking of performances, which gives the idea that we can change it. Now, obviously, we are not robots. Obviously, in every aspect of human life, there are choices, but we cannot ignore the tremendous, right? We cannot ignore the power, of economic, class, racial, colonial structure. We cannot ignore that, and think that we can decide one way or the other freely. No, this is not the case. So the question of the change of the material condition, the fight against institutional racism, the fight against the exploitation of human labor, the fight against sexual and racial divisions of labor, colonial division of labor, are fundamental. Are fundamental also for the struggle of the ability to live gender, in a way that is in conformity to our desire, to our possibilities. That's my view.
On a very different register, you spoke about governmentalization of feminism, and two members of the audience have asked questions about the state. I'll put those to you now.
Yes.
Durba Mitra has asked, since the 1970s, the state has again and again co-opted the language of the value of women's work to pursue capitalist goals. And today, global indexes measure women's participation in labor markets as a marker of development. Do we need a new lexicon to imagine women's labor and a social reproduction theory away from the vocabularies of state co-optation, which frames women's perpetual indebtedness through terms like empowerment and entrepreneurship? And Sriti Rao has asked, with respect to your points about approaching the state, how do we think about this in context where the state is unreliable or absent? Not because of neoliberalism, but fundamentally.
Yeah, I think I would need a little bit more understanding of, what is meant by where the state is absent, because if one type of state is absent, maybe another type of state is absent, right? What we are seeing across the world today more and more is that in so many places the state is being destroyed. I mean, you think of places, well, even places like Afghanistan today, think of places like Libya, think of places like Somalia, right? Where basically the idea of a state, of a nation state has been so destroyed, and you now have different groupings fighting for territorial dominance, whatever. But in the end, where a nation state is not there, what prevails is an international state. Where the nation state doesn't reach, often you have the World Bank, often you have the IMF, often you have. So I think it's very important to see that, right? And so, as has often been pointed out, the struggle is always at the local and the global level at the same time. The global is in the local and vice versa. Yeah. So that I think is very important. And the question of the other question was, tell me again the first one, briefly, and then you will come back.
Yeah, this is co-opting the status.
Yeah, the language.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think, I was addressing the question before that the state has used, the feminist language, and particularly the language of this part of the feminist movement, who associated, often also coming from a left background, associated, entering the wage workforce, with emancipation, with the beginning of a process, of liberation. They have used all of that, to portray, in fact, the presence of women in so many parts of the world economy, as indication that, women, in fact, have reached a very higher level, and it's part of development, etc. And this, I think, it's where the delusion comes from, because where you look at the condition of women, which is very, cannot be seen as uniform, it's very differentiated, right? But nevertheless, as a whole, right, it's a condition that has not in any way come near to what many feminists emancipated. Women today, are the largest workforce of the so-called informal economy, where really the work is from hand to mouth. The largest workforce of the maquila system, which I was describing before, is really a new form, the so-called free export zone, are area in which there is no labor regulation, not in terms of hours of work, condition of work, sanitary condition, ways of payment. Women are forbidden from, they're so controlled that in many cases when they enter the place, they have to take contraceptive. So there is no danger that they interrupt the work on the basis because they get pregnant. And there is no possibility of unionization and so forth, right? So we clearly, the very self-congratulating, account that we periodically read, in the United Nations report, really ignore the misery of the majority of women, and also the great explosion of the sex industry. Sex is work, and I do not say that I do not share the view of many feminists. The sex work is especially degrading. I personally believe that selling your brain, selling your integrity is worse than selling your vagina. The work that often is considered creative, but actually selling your knowledge, etc., as often it is done, through journalism or through teaching or etc., of accepting to propagate lies is far more dangerous than any sex work. So I think it is very important to actually not become captive of these glorifying accounts that glorify actually the new forms of exploitation, where women are already now exploited more fully than even in the past, if possible. Because now you are at home with the children and everything, and you are also having a job outside the home, and you're constantly juggling. You're constantly, and no space to really reproduce yourself. Even though we see now also a great creativity in women responding to this situation by coming together, by coming together and seeing how creating these new forms. Maria Galindo, who is, she's a very well-known activist in Bolivia. She's one of the creators of this organization called Mujeres Creando, has written very powerful pages, about how women in Bolivia, in response to the economic crisis, have reorganized all their reproductive life in the squares, in the streets, and how complex that reorganization, and how powerfully collaborative, because you have to cook, you have to work, as you're selling things, as you're preparing snacks, as you're dealing with the police and with the customer, you also have to keep an eye on the children, yours and the other women. You may have to help them with their homework. The situation that many women confront now because of COVID. These women have confronted it all along. Once they brought their reproductive work into the street, in seeking some income that they could not gain any longer, depending on a man, because so much work has been, so much unemployment, so much migration, and many women are the sole supporters, right? So I think we need to look at these experiences, when as an alternative, and to evaluate, the ideology that is propagated by institutions like the United Nations in their annual reports.
Wonderful. We have a final set of questions, and I think this is, and then we will wrap up, I promise, Silvia. One is, I think partly it's because of the pandemic. There is a sense that, it's claimed millions of lives in South Asia, and, women are predisposed in South Asia to reproduce. That's considered to be what a good woman does. So there's a question about, the pressure to have more children. How can one resist this? What would be the strategy of global revolutionary movements, you're being asked? And I think it's related to two other questions that came from Shraddha Jain, as well as from Shilpa Reddy, who really talk about, how are there alternative ways in which we can reconstitute the family, rather than kind of concretize, existing forms, so that we can both resist this demand to reproduce, procreate, but also to perform, unpaid domestic work. What is a good form of protest?
The question of more children, this is an important struggle. First of all, particularly thinking of India, right? The first thing that comes to children is which children? Male children or also girls? Because so many female children have been aborted, right? And so, first of all, the question of which children are valued, right? Very important struggle, which children are valued. And secondly, who decide, about the decision to have a child, right? How it is being decided. This, I think, is a very, very important question, because it brings back the relation of women's relation to men, women's relation to the family, women's relation to the community. How is that decision achieved? You know, are women really able to make the decision, and on the basis of what? More children for what? For a good life, for etc. You know, for a life that is really going to bring, you know, more strength, more power to the community, or children who in many cases is going to be a struggle to take care of. And if we decide to have children, then what kind of struggle we need to make so that the life of those children is guaranteed. So I think that there is a double issue here. One is, you know, who decides, you know, what level of power women have to be able to decide whether to have a child or not, and whether they are being forced into having more children by, for example, relatives, husbands. In other words, they are being forced for reasons that are not the reason why one should have a child. Okay, number one, you know. And number two is, once you decide to have a child, and what are the kind of structure, what are the kind of struggle, what is that we need to do to ensure, you know, that the child is really welcome. You know, the child is not just, okay, so we're going to have another child that is going to bring in some work because maybe have 5, 6, or 7, we can send that child on the street to pick up some, or at 10, etc. But that child is valued on other concern rather than simply because it may be another source of income, another source, the child labor. We have so much child labor. Today, when we speak of the global workforce, we have to realize that the number of children who are working and who are being exploited, and as we know, often in very, very brutal way, in way very close to slavery, right? So all of that has to come into discussion as to what are the forces that preside to the decision to have a child, and how much, you know, the possibility of having a child. Clearly, I'm not going to go along with the argument that says the only people who have well-to-do situations should have children. No, not at all. But rather the question then has to be posed another way. What are the kind of struggle? What are the kind of connection in the community that we need to make to ensure that even when the resources are limited, the child that comes to the world not to a situation of misery, but comes to a situation in which there is a support, even if the economic resources are limited. And I think this is the best that I can say at this point. And I think that the presence of movements, the presence of communitarian relation, the ability of a family not to be alone, not to face whatever difficulty they have alone, makes a big difference in the possibility of having a child. Because then when the child comes in, it relies not only on these two individuals whose life may be precarious, but it relies on a broader network of support. I think that's very, very important. It's very important that when we decide to have a child, we can also guarantee a broader network of support. And this connects immediately to the second question, which is what kind of family, right? Certainly a family that goes beyond the nuclear, that goes beyond the isolated. We know that that's a failure. Even if there's a lot of love, even if there's a lot of things that is obviously possible within that family, but nevertheless, the family is not a possibility because the too much expectation, too much desire, too much work is expected of that individualized family. So in the reconstruction of the family, we have to restore the idea of an extended family, not necessarily based on blood, on biological links, but based instead of affinity, based instead of community of work, etc. But we have to reconstitute the family in a way that is broader, that goes beyond the couple. The couple is a very, very fragile, suffocating and fragile institution. And in a way, it's been very convenient for capitalism because the privatization of reproduction has contributed to the occultation, to the hiding of what reproductive work actually is about. This whole story of romantic love, one of the slogans of the things that I've written that has become most popular has been, they call it love, we call it unpaid labor. That slogan is going around the world. We call it love, we call it unpaid labor. But, the couple is really a very fragile, among other things, very fragile institution. And so we need to reconstitute the family on more solid ground and a broader solidarity, broader connection. The older family where you had, elderly people and so on was much, much healthier. Also the difference of ages, it's very educational for a child. It's very educational and very supportive for a child, and this, I think, is, and that too, like the building of communitarian relation is beginning to happen, partially out of economic necessity, people coming together because it's so difficult to now have an apartment of your own, but partially also wanting to overcome the isolation and the fear and the anxiety that comes with it.
Thank you, Silvia. That was a tour de force. And we are taking many slogans with us from this talk today. I just wanted to communicate to you that other than the questions we have read out, there have been many comments by audience saying it has been a fantastic talk. People have been fascinated. Because, in this digital mode, you don't get the sense of the audience. And just to communicate to you that the audience has been very enthusiastically positive about the talk today. And to thank you really for, in the very negative, adverse, depressing scenario in which we are today, to have a slogan like Revolution Now is a very heartening, uplifting experience for all of us. I thank you again, and I will invite Professor Kotiswaran to say a few words at the end. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think this is just such a genuine pleasure, when you've read a scholar's work for a very long time, and rereading some of your work before today's lecture, I think really, at a very experiential level, drove home the points about what capitalist living does to you. And I think so you've touched us at various different levels, not just as a scholar, but as a person, as an activist. What you said about, this kind of joyful militancy just resonated so much, because I think, sometimes even the feminist field is can be incredibly disheartening. So I think you've just touched us all. I'm sure many of us have felt similarly about your work and about, your lecture today. So I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to really engage with us wholeheartedly in this very open manner. And as Sanita said, many people have expressed, gratitude for this interaction. And the least we can do is simply post this for them to revisit if they didn't have the time to listen today, and to invite them to continue to engage with you individually and through your work. So thank you on behalf of all of us for an absolutely riveting lecture. And
thank you, Prabha, and thank you, Sanita. These were your very, very generous words, and a great hug to all the listeners. And I hope that we continue this conversation. And I'm glad you brought up in closing the question of joyful militancy, because this for me is an example. This morning is an example of joyful militancy. Is an example. I always say the last thing that we want to see as alienated labor is revolutionary work, is political work, is the work that we do as feminists. You don't want to transform that in, I always say, the moment you feel like, no, I don't want to go to another meeting, you're doing something wrong. It means you have to change, because the process of changing the world is a process of changing ourselves, has to be something that liberates us. That's the litmus test, if what we are doing is something that gives life or not. And I'm glad you brought it up. And I'm glad you gave me the possibility of experiencing right now with you all. Thank you so much to you.
Thank you. Thank you. With those amazing last words, we will keep that in mind and hold it very close to our political work as we go ahead. So thank you again, and thank you all for attending. And to be continued is all I can say.
To be continued.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much.